Picture this, the rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil echoing through the morning air of Cedar Falls, Montana, where the scent of coal smoke mingles with the promise of a new day. In 1874, this frontier town sat perched between civilization and the wild unknown, a place where Eastern refinement met Western grit, where proper ladies sipped tea while cowboys spat tobacco, and where the most unlikely love stories were forged in the very fires that shaped horseshoes and mended broken dreams. Emma Hartwell stepped off the dusty stagecoach with a leather satchel in one hand and a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets in the other, her traveling dress wilted from 3 days of prairie heat and road dust. At 24, she was older than most unmarried women who ventured west, but Emma had never been one to follow conventional paths. While her sisters back in Boston had married bankers and doctors, settling into lives of quiet domesticity, Emma had answered an advertisement for a school teacher in the Montana Territory, seeking something her comfortable but suffocating life back east could never provide. The chance to matter, to make a difference, to live a story worth reading. She hadn't expected the town to be quite so primitive. Cedar Falls boasted a main street of packed dirt, buildings that looked like they'd been thrown together with whatever lumber was handy, and a general air of making do with what you had. But there was something honest about it, something real that the marble facades and manicured gardens of Boston had always lacked. This was a place where people worked with their hands, where every day was a battle won through sweat and determination. The sound drew her attention before she even saw its source, the steady, powerful rhythm of metal striking metal, a percussion that seemed to set the very heartbeat of the town. Following the sound around the corner of the general store, Emma discovered its origin, a blacksmith shop, its doors thrown wide to reveal the dancing orange glow of a forge fire. And there, silhouetted against the flames like some figure from ancient mythology, stood the blacksmith himself. Thomas Brennan was everything Emma's refined upbringing had taught her to avoid. Rough, powerful, his white cotton shirt clinging to muscles earned through honest labor, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with strength. His dark hair was damp with sweat, his face focused with the intense concentration of a craftsman perfecting his art. He moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in his element, each swing of the hammer precise and purposeful. Emma found herself frozen on the threshold, mesmerized by the raw masculinity of the scene. In Boston, gentlemen were soft-spoken and pale, their hands smooth from lives spent handling nothing more strenuous than pen and paper. But Thomas Brennan was something else entirely, primitive and elemental, like the fire he commanded. He must have sensed her presence because he looked up from his work, hammer pausing mid-swing. Their eyes met across the smoky interior of the shop, and Emma felt something shift in her chest, something she'd never experienced in all her years of proper courtships and suitable beaux. Thomas's eyes were blue as summer sky, and they studied her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of every detail of her appearance, her traveling dress, her carefully pinned hair, the book she still clutched in her gloved hand. She saw his gaze linger on the book, something unreadable flickering across his features, before he carefully set down his hammer and wiped his hands on a leather apron. "Can I help you, miss?" His voice was rough from the heat and smoke, with a faint trace of an Irish accent that spoke of immigrant roots and hard-won respectability. Emma stepped into the shop, drawn by curiosity and something else she couldn't quite name. The heat hit her like a physical force, making her suddenly conscious of her corseted propriety in this place of raw elements. "I'm Emma Hartwell, the new school teacher. I was just exploring the town." "Thomas Brennan," he replied, inclining his head with a courtesy that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "Welcome to Cedar Falls, Miss Hartwell." The formal introduction felt strange in this setting, as if they were playing at civilization while surrounded by the ancient dance of fire and iron. Emma's gaze wandered over the shop, taking in the organized chaos of tools and projects in various stages of completion. There was an artistry to it that surprised her, a careful attention to both function and form that spoke of a craftsman who took pride in his work. "It's quite fascinating," she said, genuine interest coloring her voice. "I've never seen a blacksmith at work before." Something shifted in Thomas's expression. Surprise, perhaps, that a refined Eastern lady would find interest in his rough trade. "It's honest work," he said simply. "Nothing fancy about it." Emma picked up a horseshoe from a nearby workbench, running her fingers over the smooth curve of metal. "There's beauty in honest work," she said thoughtfully. "There's something pure about creating something useful with your own hands." Thomas watched her examine his handiwork, and Emma caught something in his expression that made her heart skip. A mixture of pride and vulnerability, as if her approval mattered more than it should to a man confident in his craft. "Most folks don't see it that way," he said quietly. "Most see dirty hands and sweaty labor." Emma looked up at him, really looked, seeing past the surface to something deeper. "Then most folks aren't looking hard enough." The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and the kind of recognition that happens rarely in a lifetime. Emma had read about such moments in her beloved novels, but she'd never experienced one herself. That instant when two souls recognize something kindred in each other across all the barriers of circumstance and expectation. "Miss Hartwell!" The sharp voice shattered the spell, and Emma turned to see a stern-faced woman in black approaching the shop. "I am Mrs. Abernathy, head of the school board. We've been looking everywhere for you." Emma stepped away from Thomas, suddenly conscious of how the scene might appear to judgmental eyes. The refined school teacher alone with the town blacksmith, flushed from heat and something else entirely. "Of course," Emma said, smoothing her skirts and retrieving her composure along with her book. "I was just familiarizing myself with the community." Mrs. Abernathy's disapproving gaze swept over the shop, lingering pointedly on Thomas before returning to Emma. "Indeed. Well, we have much to discuss about your duties. The children of Cedar Falls need proper guidance, proper examples of refined behavior." As Emma followed the older woman from the shop, she cast one last glance over her shoulder at Thomas. He had returned to his work, but she caught him watching her leave, and something in his expression promised that this was not their last encounter. Walking away from the forge, Emma felt as if she were leaving warmth and light for the cold propriety of expectations. But she also felt something new stirring in her chest. Curiosity, attraction, and the thrilling possibility that her carefully planned new life might hold surprises she'd never dared to imagine. Behind her, the ring of hammer on anvil resumed, but now it seemed to beat in rhythm with her heart, calling her back to the fire and the man who commanded it. This is the story of how a refined Eastern school teacher discovered that the most important lessons aren't always found in books, and how a humble blacksmith learned that some things like love are worth any amount of heat and pressure to forge into something lasting and true. Emma's first week in Cedar Falls passed in a whirlwind of settling into her new life, organizing the one-room schoolhouse, meeting her students, and trying to navigate the complex social hierarchy of a frontier town. The schoolhouse itself was a far cry from the well-appointed academies she'd known in Boston, with its rough-hewn benches, pot-bellied stove, and windows that let in as much dust as light. But there was something honest about it that appealed to her, something real that her previous teaching positions had lacked. Her students ranged in age from 6 to 16, children of merchants, farmers, and laborers who hungered for knowledge with an intensity that both humbled and inspired her. They didn't take education for granted the way her privileged Boston pupils had. Every lesson was precious, every book a treasure to be cherished. But throughout that first week, Emma found her thoughts drifting to the blacksmith shop and its owner. She'd walked past the forge several times, always finding an excuse: errands at the general store, visits to the church, explorations of her new town. Each time, the rhythmic hammering drew her like a siren song, and each time she caught glimpses of Thomas at work, she felt that same peculiar flutter in her chest. It was Thursday evening when he finally appeared at the schoolhouse door. Emma was alone, staying late to prepare lessons by lamplight, when she heard the hesitant knock. She looked up from her papers to see Thomas's silhouette in the doorway, hat in hand, looking as uncomfortable as she'd ever seen him. "Mr. Brennan," she said, rising from her desk with surprise and something that might have been pleasure. "What brings you here so late?" Thomas shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked almost like embarrassment. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Hartwell." I saw your light was still on, and He trailed off, seeming to struggle with whatever had brought him here. Please, come in, Emma said gently, sensing his discomfort. Is there something I can help you with? Thomas stepped into the schoolhouse, and Emma was immediately aware of how different he looked in this setting. Larger somehow, more elemental, his work clothes and calloused hands a stark contrast to the refined atmosphere she'd tried to create with her books and maps and carefully arranged lesson plans. It's a foolish thing, he said finally, his Irish accent more pronounced in his nervousness. I've been thinking about what you said, about honest work having beauty. And I got to wondering. He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. I got to wondering what it might be like to see that beauty the way you do. Through books, I mean. Emma felt her breath catch as the understanding dawned. You want to learn to read? The admission seemed to cost him something. His jaw tightened, and she could see the pride warring with need in his expression. I know it's not proper, a grown man asking for such help, and I know you must think me ignorant. I think nothing of the sort, Emma interrupted firmly. I think you're brave. It takes courage to ask for what you need, especially when it makes you vulnerable. Thomas looked at her then, really looked, and Emma saw surprise in his blue eyes. Most folks would see it as shameful. A man my age who can't read his own name properly. Most folks are fools, Emma replied with more heat than she'd intended. The desire to learn, to grow, to become more than circumstances have made you. That's not shameful, Mr. Brennan. That's admirable. Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of something deeper than the surface interaction of teacher and student. Emma moved to the student benches, gesturing for him to sit. We'll start with the basics, she said, pulling out a primer she used with her youngest students. But as Thomas attempted to fold his large frame into the child-sized desk, she realized the absurdity of the situation and began to laugh. Perhaps we should arrange something more suitable, she said, her eyes dancing with amusement. Thomas's lips quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. I'm not sure anything about this situation is suitable, Miss Hartwell. The comment hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized he was right. A single woman alone with a man after dark, in the intimate setting of shared learning, was decidedly improper by the standards of both East and West. Perhaps, she said carefully, we should arrange for daytime lessons. After school hours, but while there's still proper daylight. I wouldn't want to impose on your time, Thomas said, though she could hear the hope in his voice. It wouldn't be an imposition, Emma replied, and meant it. Teaching is what I do, Mr. Brennan, and I have a feeling you'll prove to be an excellent student. They settled on meeting 3 afternoons a week after Emma's regular students had gone home. As Thomas prepared to leave, Emma found herself reluctant to see him go. Mr. Brennan, she called as he reached the door, may I ask what changed your mind? About learning to read? Thomas paused, his hand on the doorframe. When he turned back to her, his expression was more open than she'd yet seen it. I've spent my whole life working with my hands, he said quietly. Creating things, fixing things, shaping metal into something useful and beautiful. But watching you handle that book the other day, seeing the way words seemed to come alive for you, he shrugged, suddenly self-conscious again. I suppose I wondered what it might be like to shape letters into meaning, to create something beautiful with more than just fire and iron. Emma felt something warm unfurl in her chest at his words. Books are wonderful, Mr. Brennan, but they're just tools, like your hammer and anvil. What makes them beautiful is what you bring to them. Your experience, your perspective, your heart. Thomas was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the lamplight. You're not what I expected in a school teacher, Miss Hartwell. What did you expect? Someone more like Mrs. Abernathy, I suppose, stern and proper and disapproving of anything that doesn't fit into neat little boxes? Emma laughed softly. I assure you, Mr. Brennan, I am quite properly disapproving when the situation calls for it. But I've never seen the point in disapproving of someone's desire to better themselves. Their first lesson took place 2 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, when the schoolhouse was empty and the town was quiet with weekend rest. Emma had arranged 2 regular chairs near the window, where the natural light was best for reading, and she'd selected a simple primer designed for adult learners. Thomas arrived precisely on time, wearing what were clearly his best clothes: a clean white shirt, dark trousers, his hair still damp from a recent washing. The effort he'd taken with his appearance touched Emma more than she cared to admit. "Shall we begin?" she asked, settling into her chair with the primer open between them. What followed was perhaps the most intimate hour Emma had ever spent with another human being. There was something profoundly moving about watching a grown man struggle with concepts that came as naturally as breathing to her, yet approach each challenge with the same focused intensity he brought to his metalwork. Thomas's hands, so confident when wielding hammer and tongs, trembled slightly as he traced letters with his finger. His voice, which commanded the forge with such authority, became hesitant and uncertain when sounding out simple words. But his determination was absolute, and Emma found herself admiring his courage more with each passing minute. "This is harder than it looks," he admitted after struggling with a particularly challenging word. "Everything worthwhile is," Emma replied, "but you're doing wonderfully. Look how far you've come in just one lesson." Thomas glanced up at her, and Emma realized how close they'd moved to each other, their heads bent together over the book, her hand resting near his on the page. The proximity sent a thrill through her that had nothing to do with pedagogy and everything to do with the warm strength of his presence beside her. "Miss Hartwell," Thomas said quietly, his voice rougher than usual, "I want you to know how much this means to me. Not just the reading, but the way you're going about it, without making me feel small or stupid." Emma turned to face him fully, struck by the vulnerability in his expression. "You're neither small nor stupid, Mr. Brennan. You're one of the most capable men I've ever met. The fact that you never had the opportunity to learn letters doesn't change that." "In Boston," Thomas said slowly, "would a woman like you even speak to a man like me?" The question hung between them, honest and direct in the way that only frontier life seemed to permit. Emma considered it seriously, thinking of her previous life with its rigid social stratifications and unbreachable class boundaries. "In Boston," she said finally, "I probably never would have met a man like you. Our paths would never have crossed. But if they had—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I hope I would have had the sense to recognize quality when I saw it, regardless of social position." Thomas's smile was slow and warm, transforming his entire face. "I'm beginning to think Cedar Falls is a lucky place for both of us, Miss Hartwell." As their lesson concluded and Thomas prepared to leave, Emma found herself already looking forward to their next meeting. Watching him walk away, she realized that somewhere in the space of shared learning, something fundamental had shifted between them. She was no longer just the school teacher, and he was no longer just the blacksmith. They were becoming something else entirely. Two people discovering that the most important education happened not in books, but in the careful exploration of another person's heart and mind. That evening, as Emma prepared her lessons for Monday, she found herself thinking not about her regular students, but about the way Thomas's eyes lit up when he successfully decoded a difficult word, the way his hands moved with such careful precision over the pages, the way his presence had filled the schoolhouse with something warm and vital. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Falls, Emma felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Over the next 3 weeks, Emma's afternoons took on a rhythm she'd never experienced before, one that had nothing to do with lesson plans and everything to do with the way Thomas Brennan transformed when he was learning. His initial hesitancy had given way to an eager determination that both impressed and moved her. He approached each new word like a problem to be solved, each sentence like a piece of metal to be shaped into something meaningful. But it was during their 4th lesson that Emma discovered there was far more to the town blacksmith than she'd imagined. "I brought something," Thomas said as he settled into his chair, producing a small wrapped bundle from his jacket pocket. "Thought it might help with the lessons." Emma watched curiously as he unwrapped what appeared to be a piece of metal, but as he held it up to the light, she gasped in surprise. It was a bookmark, but not just any bookmark. Thomas had crafted it from steel, shaping it into an elegant feather with intricate details that caught and reflected the afternoon sunlight streaming through the schoolhouse window. "You made this," Emma asked, taking the delicate piece from his calloused hands. The metal was warm from his touch, and she could see where he'd carefully filed and polished every curve until it gleamed like silver. "It's nothing fancy," Thomas said, but she could hear the pride beneath his modest tone. "Thought you might have use for it, seeing as how you're always handling books." Emma ran her finger along the bookmark's surface, marveling at the skill required to create something so beautiful from raw iron. "This is exquisite." The detail work alone must have taken hours. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I like working on the small pieces when I have time. Most folks just want horseshoes and hinges, practical things. But sometimes," he trailed off, as if revealing too much. "Sometimes you create art," Emma finished softly, understanding flooding through her. "This isn't just metalwork, Thomas. This is sculpture." The use of his first name hung in the air between them, a breach of propriety that neither acknowledged but both felt. Thomas looked at her with something like wonder, as if she'd seen something in him that he'd kept hidden from the world. "You really think so?" he asked quietly. "That it's art?" "I know so," Emma replied firmly. "My father was a patron of the arts in Boston. I've seen work in galleries that wasn't half as skillfully crafted as this." A flush of pleasure crossed Thomas's features, and Emma realized that no one had ever called his work art before. The revelation stirred something protective in her chest. This talented, intelligent man had been dismissed by society simply because he worked with his hands instead of his mind, never realizing that the highest art combined both. "Tell me," she said, setting the bookmark carefully on the table between them, "when you're creating something like this, what are you thinking about?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering. "It's hard to explain. When I'm working on practical pieces, horseshoes, wagon repairs, my mind is on function. Will it hold? Will it last? But when I make the small things," he paused, searching for words, "it's like I'm trying to catch something beautiful and hold it still. The way sunlight looks on water, or how a bird moves through the air. I can't paint it or write it down, but I can shape it in metal." Emma felt her breath catch at the poetry in his words. "That's exactly what art is, Thomas. It's capturing beauty and making it permanent." Their lesson that day took on a different quality. As Thomas worked through his reading exercises, Emma found herself watching not just his progress with letters, but the way his hands moved over the page, the same careful precision he brought to his metalwork. When he stumbled over a particularly difficult passage, she moved her chair closer to help and was suddenly aware of his warmth, the scent of coal smoke and soap that seemed to cling to his clothes. "This word," Thomas said, pointing to a line in the primer, "I can't make sense of it." Emma leaned in to see where he was pointing, her shoulder brushing against his arm. "Beautiful," she said softly. "The word is beautiful." Thomas looked up at her, their faces suddenly very close. "Beautiful," he repeated, but his eyes weren't on the page anymore. The moment stretched between them, charged with something that had nothing to do with education and everything to do with the recognition passing between a man and a woman. Emma could see flecks of gold in Thomas's blue eyes, could count the dark lashes that framed them. She was close enough to see the small scar above his left eyebrow, probably from some accident at the forge, close enough to feel his breath warm against her cheek. "Emma," he said quietly, her name a question and a statement all at once. The sound of her given name on his lips sent a shiver through her that she felt all the way to her toes. This was dangerous territory. A single woman, a man who wasn't her husband, the kind of intimacy that could ruin her reputation and cost her position. But as she looked into Thomas's eyes, Emma found she didn't care about propriety or reputation or anything except the way he was looking at her, as if she were something precious he was afraid to touch. "We should," she began, but never finished the thought because Thomas's hand came up to cup her cheek, his calloused palm rough and warm against her skin. "Should what?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. "Continue with the lesson," Emma whispered, but she made no move to pull away. "Aye," Thomas agreed, but his thumb brushed across her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "We should." Neither of them moved. The schoolhouse around them faded away, leaving nothing but the two of them suspended in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible. Emma had read about such moments in novels, but she'd never experienced the reality, the way time seemed to slow, the way her heart hammered against her ribs, the way every nerve in her body seemed focused on the point where Thomas's skin touched hers. Then from outside came the sound of voices approaching the schoolhouse, Mrs. Abernathy's sharp tones cutting through the spell like a blade. Thomas dropped his hand immediately, and Emma jerked back so quickly she nearly overturned her chair. By the time Mrs. Abernathy appeared in the doorway, with two other members of the school board, Emma was standing at the blackboard pointing out grammatical structures, while Thomas sat properly in his student chair, primer open before him. "Miss Hartwell," Mrs. Abernathy said, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. "I wasn't aware you were conducting private lessons." "Mr. Brennan expressed a desire to improve his reading," Emma replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite her racing pulse. "I thought it admirable and offered to help." "How charitable of you," Mrs. Abernathy said, the word dripping with disapproval, "though I do hope you're not neglecting your regular duties for such extracurricular activities." "Of course not," Emma said firmly. "These lessons take place after school hours and don't interfere with my regular teaching schedule." One of the other board members, Mr. Patterson, cleared his throat. "Perhaps it would be more appropriate for such lessons to take place in a more public setting. The church, perhaps, or with other adults present." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Thomas spoke up. "That's a fine idea," he said, rising from his chair with dignity intact. "I appreciate Miss Hartwell's willingness to help a student, regardless of age. It speaks well of her dedication to education." His words were perfectly proper, his tone respectful, but Emma caught the slight emphasis on dedication and realized he was defending her reputation while appearing to defer to the board member's authority. After the school board left with several pointed reminders about maintaining proper appearances, Emma and Thomas found themselves alone again, but the spell had been thoroughly broken. "I should go," Thomas said, gathering up his primer. "Don't want to cause you any trouble with the town officials." "Thomas, wait," Emma called as he headed for the door. "About what happened?" "Nothing happened," he said firmly, but his eyes told a different story. "You were helping a student with his reading." "Nothing more." Emma nodded, though they both knew it was a lie. Something had happened, something that changed the fundamental nature of their relationship. The carefully maintained distance between teacher and student, between refined lady and working man, had cracked, revealing something far more dangerous and infinitely more precious underneath. "Same time Thursday?" Thomas asked, pausing at the doorway. "Same time Thursday," Emma confirmed. As she watched him walk away, Emma realized that their lessons had become something neither of them had anticipated. Yes, Thomas was learning to read. His progress was remarkable and genuine. But both of them were learning something else entirely, that the heart recognizes quality regardless of social position, that attraction could bloom between the most unlikely people, and that some lessons couldn't be found in any book. That night, Emma lay in her narrow bed in the boarding house, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what was happening to her. She'd come to Cedar Falls to teach, to make a difference, to find purpose beyond the suffocating expectations of Eastern society. She hadn't expected to find a man who challenged everything she thought she knew about class, education, and what made someone worthy of respect and love. The bookmark Thomas had made lay on her bedside table, catching the moonlight streaming through her window. As she drifted off to sleep, Emma found herself thinking not about the impropriety of her growing feelings, but about the poetry in Thomas's description of his art, the gentleness in his calloused hands, and the way he'd looked at her as if she were something beautiful he wanted to capture and hold forever. Some lessons she was learning were worth any risk. The whispers started the very next day. Emma first noticed them at the general store, where conversations seemed to die the moment she entered, only to resume in hushed tones behind her back. Mrs. Henderson, who had always been friendly enough, suddenly found urgent business in the fabric section whenever Emma approached. Even young Sally Morrison, one of her brightest students, seemed to avoid making eye contact during morning lessons. By Wednesday, the situation had escalated from whispers to outright confrontation. "Miss Hartwell," Mrs. Abernathy's voice cut through the afternoon quiet as Emma was dismissing her students. "A word, if you please." Emma sent the children on their way with their assignments. Noting how they hurried past Mrs. Abernathy with the instinctive wariness children showed to adults who disapproved of everything. Once the schoolhouse was empty, Mrs. Abernathy closed the door with an ominous click. "I think you know why I'm here," the older woman said, her steel-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into permanent disapproval. "I'm afraid I don't," Emma replied, though her stomach was already nodding with dread. "The blacksmith," Mrs. Abernathy said bluntly. "Your tutoring sessions?" Emma lifted her chin, refusing to be cowed. "Mr. Brennan is making excellent progress with his reading. I fail to see what concern that is of yours beyond the general improvement of the education in our community." "Don't play innocent with me, young lady," Mrs. Abernathy snapped. "The entire town is talking about the inappropriate relationship developing between you and that man, a single woman alone with a tradesman, in circumstances that can only be called compromising." "I am a teacher," Emma said firmly. "Mr. Brennan is a student. There is nothing inappropriate about education." Mrs. Abernathy's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Education? Is that what you call the way he looks at you? The way you blush whenever his name is mentioned? My dear Miss Hartwell, you may have fooled yourself, but you haven't fooled anyone else in this town." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, hating that her reaction only proved the woman's point. "My personal feelings are irrelevant to my professional duties." "Your personal feelings are exactly the problem," Mrs. Abernathy replied coldly. "You were hired to be a moral example to our children, to represent the refinement and propriety that we want them to aspire to. Instead, you're carrying on with a man so far beneath your station that it's become a scandal." The casual cruelty in her words, the dismissal of Thomas as someone beneath Emma's station, sparked a fury in Emma that surprised her with its intensity. "Thomas Brennan is worth 10 of the so-called gentlemen I knew in Boston," Emma said, her voice deadly quiet. "He's intelligent, talented, hardworking, and decent. If this community can't recognize those qualities simply because he works with his hands instead of pushing papers behind a desk, then perhaps the problem isn't with him, it's with all of you." Mrs. Abernathy's face went white with shock at Emma's vehement defense. "Miss Hartwell, I strongly advise you to reconsider your position. The school board has been very patient, but our patience has limits. Continue down this path, and you will find yourself dismissed and disgraced with no hope of finding another teaching position anywhere in the territory." The threat hung in the air between them like a blade. Emma knew it wasn't empty. Mrs. Abernathy had the influence to make good on her promise. A dismissed teacher, especially one dismissed for moral impropriety, would find no welcome in any respectable school. "Is that all?" Emma asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "End it," Mrs. Abernathy said simply. "End whatever is happening between you and the blacksmith, publicly and finally. That's the only way to salvage your reputation in your career." After Mrs. Abernathy left, Emma sank into her chair, hands shaking with reaction. The weight of the ultimatum pressed down on her like a physical force. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd sacrificed to build her independent life, hung in the balance. But as she sat there in the quiet schoolhouse, surrounded by the books and maps and carefully prepared lessons that represented her life's work, Emma found herself thinking not about what she stood to lose, but about what she'd already found. Thomas's quiet intelligence, his gentle strength, the way he looked at the world with an artist's eye despite never having been taught that art was something he was allowed to create. The sound of the schoolhouse door opening pulled her from her thoughts. Thomas stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his usual confident posture replaced by something more hesitant. "I heard Mrs. Abernathy was here," he said quietly. "Thought I should come by to make sure you're all right." Emma looked at him, really looked, taking in the concern in his blue eyes. The careful way he held himself as if afraid his very presence might cause her more trouble. In that moment, she realized that Mrs. Abernathy was wrong about one thing. This wasn't just about Emma's reputation or career. It was about Thomas, too, and what the town's disapproval might do to a man who had already spent too much of his life believing he wasn't good enough. "Thomas," she said softly, "we need to talk." He closed the door behind him and approached her desk, but didn't sit in his usual chair. Instead, he remained standing, as if preparing to leave quickly if necessary. "They're saying we should stop the lessons," Emma said without preamble. "Mrs. Abernathy made it clear that my position depends on it." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I expected as much. I've been hearing the talk around town." "What kind of talk?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, and Emma could see him weighing his words carefully. "Nothing you need to trouble yourself with," he said finally. "Thomas?" "The usual things," he admitted reluctantly. "Questions about what a refined lady like you could want with a man like me. Speculation about, well, about things that aren't true and aren't anyone's business if they were." Emma felt a fresh wave of anger at the town's small-minded cruelty, but also something else, a growing certainty about what she wanted to do, regardless of the consequences. "What if they were true?" she asked quietly. Thomas went very still. "What? What if they were true? What if there was something between us beyond teacher and student?" Emma rose from her chair, moving around the desk to stand closer to him. "What if I told you that somewhere in the past month I've stopped thinking of you as just another student and started thinking of you as something more?" "Emma," Thomas said, her name rough on his lips, "you don't know what you're saying. You don't understand what it would mean." "I understand perfectly," Emma interrupted. "I understand that caring for you could cost me my position, my reputation, any hope of a respectable future. I understand that society will never accept a relationship between a school teacher and a blacksmith. I understand all of it." Thomas stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Then why are you saying it?" Emma reached up to touch his face, her palm against the slight roughness of his jaw. "Because I also understand that I've never met a man who saw beauty in everything around him, who created art from iron and fire, who had the courage to ask for help when he needed it, and the kindness to worry about my reputation even when his own was being torn apart." Thomas closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "Emma, if we do this, if we cross this line, there's no going back. The town will never forgive it, and they'll make sure you pay the price." "Maybe," Emma said softly. "Or maybe it's time someone in Cedar Falls stood up and proved that a person's worth isn't determined by their social position or their occupation, but by their character and their heart." Thomas opened his eyes and Emma saw something fierce and hopeful burning in their depths. "You're willing to fight for this? For us?" "I'm willing to fight for what matters," Emma replied. "And Thomas Brennan, you matter more than any job or any reputation or any small-minded town gossip." Thomas's hands came up to frame her face, his calloused palms gentle against her skin. "Emma Hartwell," he said softly, "you are the bravest woman I've ever met." "Then be brave with me," Emma whispered, and rose up on her toes to press her lips to his. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if both of them were afraid to fully acknowledge what was happening between them. But then Thomas's arms came around her, pulling her closer, and Emma felt something inside her catch fire. This was what she'd been missing in all those proper courtships back in Boston. This sense of rightness, of coming home to someone who saw her not as she was supposed to be, but as she truly was. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Emma knew that everything had changed. They'd crossed the line from propriety into something deeper and more dangerous, something worth fighting for no matter what it cost. "So what do we do now?" Thomas asked, his forehead resting against hers. Emma smiled, feeling more certain than she had about anything in her life. "Now we show this town what real courage looks like." Outside the schoolhouse, the sun was setting over Cedar Falls, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. But inside, as two people who'd found each other against all odds held each other close, the future burned bright with possibility, dangerous, uncertain, but finally truly alive. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, carried by the same stagecoach that had brought Emma to Cedar Falls 2 months earlier. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house handed it to Emma with barely concealed curiosity, noting the expensive paper and the Boston postmark. Emma recognized the handwriting immediately, her mother's precise, elegant script, and felt her stomach clench with dread. She tucked the letter into her reticule without opening it, but its weight seemed to press against her all through her morning lessons. By lunch, she couldn't stand the suspense any longer. "My dearest Emma," the letter began, "I trust this finds you well and properly settled in your Western adventure. Your father and I have been patient, believing that a few months in that rustic environment would satisfy your need for independence and bring you to your senses. However, we have recently received some very disturbing correspondence from a Mrs. Abernathy regarding your conduct with a local tradesman. I can only hope these reports have been greatly exaggerated." Emma's hands trembled as she continued reading. "Regardless of the truth of these allegations, your father and I have decided it is time for you to return to civilization. Mr. Reginald Worthington has expressed renewed interest in a match, despite the unfortunate ending to your previous engagement. He is willing to overlook your temporary lapse in judgment in your adventure in the territories, provided you return immediately and conduct yourself with appropriate discretion henceforth." The letter went on to detail the arrangements already made for her return. A substantial sum had been sent to the Cedar Falls Bank to cover any obligations and travel expenses, and a private carriage would arrive within the week to escort her back to Boston. "Do not mistake this for a request, Emma. Your reputation, and by extension our family standing, cannot survive much more of this scandal, and whatever inappropriate attachment you may have formed, and return home before irreparable damage is done. Your loving but increasingly concerned mother, Mrs. Charles Hartwell." Emma set the letter down with shaking hands, her mind reeling. Mrs. Abernathy had written to her parents. The woman had gone behind Emma's back, reaching across a continent to try to control her life through family pressure and social manipulation. But worse than the betrayal was the mention of Reginald Worthington. Emma closed her eyes, remembering the man who had courted her for 2 years, with all the persistence of a businessman closing a deal. Reginald was everything her parents considered suitable: wealthy, well-connected, impeccably bred. He was also cold, controlling, and utterly without imagination or passion. Emma had broken their engagement 6 months before coming west, unable to face a lifetime of suffocating propriety with a man who saw her as an acquisition rather than a person. Now he was willing to overlook her Western adventure, as if her growth and independence were simply embarrassing mistakes to be forgotten. Emma was still staring at the letter when Thomas arrived for their afternoon lesson. One look at her face told him something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked, crossing to her immediately. Without a word, Emma handed him the letter. Thomas read it slowly, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he set it down gently and looked at her with eyes full of understanding and something that might have been resignation. "They want you to go back," he said quietly. "They're demanding I go back," Emma corrected. "There's a difference." Thomas was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "Is there? Emma, these are your parents, your family. They're offering you everything: security, respectability, a future without scandal or struggle." "They're offering me a cage," Emma replied fiercely. "A beautiful gilded cage with a man I don't love, and a life that would slowly kill everything vital inside me." "And what's the alternative?" Thomas asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Staying here? Facing the town's disapproval every day? Watching your career destroyed, your reputation ruined, all for a man who can barely read his own name?" Emma stood abruptly, anger flashing in her eyes. "Don't you dare," she said. "Don't you dare diminish what you are or what we have because you're afraid." "I'm not afraid," Thomas said, rising to face her. "I'm practical. I know what happens to women who defy their families, who throw away their chances for security and respectability. I've seen them, Emma, working in saloons, taking in laundry, growing old and bitter because they chose passion over prudence." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "I think you're choosing me over everything safe and sensible in your life, and I can't let you do that without being certain it's what you really want." "What I want," Emma stepped closer to him, her eyes blazing. "What I want is to stop having this conversation as if I'm a child who doesn't understand the consequences of her actions. What I want is for you to stop trying to protect me from my own choices." "Emma." "No, let me finish," she interrupted. "What I want is to build a life with a man who sees beauty in everyday things, who creates art from iron and fire, who had the courage to ask for help when he needed it. What I want is to teach children in a place where education matters, where every lesson isn't taken for granted. What I want is to wake up every morning knowing that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, with exactly the person I'm supposed to be with. Thomas stared at her, something fierce and hopeful warring with doubt in his expression. And what about when the novelty wears off? What about when you realize what you've given up? A comfortable life? Social position? A husband who can provide for you properly? Thomas Brennan, Emma said, stepping close enough to place her hands on his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her palms. If you think what I feel for you is novelty, then you haven't been paying attention during our lessons. I can't give you what he can, Thomas said quietly, covering her hands with his. I can't give you fine dresses, or elegant carriages, or a house with servants. I can't even give you a husband who can write you proper love letters. Emma smiled, feeling tears prick at her eyes. You gave me a bookmark made from steel that you shaped with your own hands. You've given me laughter and honest conversation and the most passionate kiss of my life. You've given me a reason to fight for something that matters. She paused, her voice growing soft but utterly certain. And as for love letters, Thomas, you've been writing me love letters every day. Every time you struggle with a difficult word because learning matters to you, every time you share your thoughts about beauty and art, every time you look at me like I'm something precious, those are love letters written in a language more beautiful than any poetry. Thomas closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against hers. Emma, if you choose this, if you choose me, there's no going back. Your family will disown you. Society will shun you. You'll be starting over with nothing but what we can build together. Then we'll build something extraordinary, Emma replied without hesitation. Before Thomas could respond, the schoolhouse door burst open. Mrs. Abernathy stood in the doorway, but she wasn't alone. Behind her was a tall, distinguished man in an expensive traveling suit, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the dust of the road. Miss Hartwell, Mrs. Abernathy said with grim satisfaction, your father has arrived. Emma's blood ran cold as Charles Hartwell stepped into the schoolhouse, his cold blue eyes taking in the scene. His daughter standing intimately close to the town blacksmith, their hands intertwined, the obvious familiarity between them. Emma, her father said, his voice carrying all the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, step away from that man immediately. Emma felt Thomas start to release her hands, but she held on tighter. Father, she said, lifting her chin with a dignity that matched his own, I'd like you to meet Thomas Brennan. Thomas, this is my father. Charles Hartwell didn't acknowledge the introduction. Pack your belongings, Emma. We're leaving within the hour. No, Emma said simply. The word fell into the schoolhouse like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock that seemed to fill the silence. Charles Hartwell was a man who had built a fortune through determination and ruthless business acumen. He was not accustomed to being defied, least of all by his own daughter. I beg your pardon, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. I said no, Father. I'm not leaving. Charles's gaze shifted to Thomas, assessing him like an opponent across a business negotiation. You, leave, now. Thomas squeezed Emma's hands once, then started to step back, but Emma moved with him, maintaining their connection. Thomas stays, she said firmly. This concerns him as much as it concerns me. This concerns your future, your reputation, and your family's honor, Charles replied coldly. It has nothing to do with this person. Emma felt anger rise in her chest at her father's dismissive tone. This person has a name, and he matters to me. If you can't show him basic respect, then you and I have nothing to discuss. Father and daughter stared at each other across the schoolhouse, two strong wills locked in conflict. Finally, Charles spoke, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Very well, Emma. Let me make this simple for you. Come home now, marry Reginald Worthington, and resume your proper place in society, or remain here with your attachment and consider yourself no longer my daughter. You will receive no financial support, no family connections, no help of any kind. You will be dead to us. The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword over Emma's head. Everything she had ever known, everyone she had ever loved except the man beside her, contingent on this single choice. Emma looked at her father, really looked at him, seeing not the imposing patriarch of her childhood, but a man so bound by social expectations that he would disown his own daughter rather than accept that love might transcend class boundaries. Then she looked at Thomas, seeing the fear in his eyes. Not fear for himself, but fear for what she was about to sacrifice. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Father," Emma said quietly, her voice steady despite the breaking of her heart. "But I choose love." Charles Hartwell's face went white with rage and shock. "You're throwing away everything. Everything I've worked to build. Everything I've given you. For a blacksmith?" "I'm not throwing anything away," Emma replied, tears streaming down her face, but her voice growing stronger. "I'm choosing to build something new. Something honest and real and worth having." Without another word, Charles Hartwell turned and walked out of the schoolhouse, Mrs. Abernathy trailing behind him like a vulture following a storm. In the silence that followed, Emma felt Thomas's arms come around her, holding her close as she shook with reaction. "Emma," he whispered against her hair, "what have we done?" "We've chosen each other," Emma replied, clinging to his strength. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Outside, the sound of a carriage departing marked the end of Emma's old life and the beginning of something entirely new. It would be difficult, uncertain, probably scandalous. It would also be theirs. The morning after her father's departure, Emma woke to find a notice posted on the schoolhouse door. "Due to circumstances beyond our control, Mrs. Hartwell's teaching position has been terminated effective immediately. Classes are suspended until a suitable replacement can be found. Cedar Falls School Board." Emma stared at the notice for a long moment, feeling the weight of what she'd chosen settling over her like a heavy cloak. No job, no family support, no prospects, just the clothes on her back and a heart full of love for a man the town considered beneath her. "Second thoughts?" Thomas's voice came from behind her, gentle but careful. Emma turned to find him approaching with 2 cups of coffee and something that might have been concern or resignation in his blue eyes. "None whatsoever," she said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Though I admit I'm not entirely sure what comes next." Thomas leaned against the schoolhouse wall beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, but far enough to maintain propriety. Even now, he was protecting her reputation as much as he could. "I've been thinking about that," he said quietly. "There's a room above my shop. It's not much, just a place I store materials, but it could be made livable. Separate entrance, completely proper. You could." He paused, clearly struggling with the implications. "You could stay there until we figure things out." Emma felt a rush of warmth at his careful consideration, his determination to protect her honor, even as the town whispered about their relationship. "Thomas, I appreciate the offer, but I won't have you compromised any further because of me. And I won't have you sleeping in the street because of me," Thomas replied firmly. "Emma, if we're doing this, if we're building something together, then we do it right, with respect for each other and for what we mean to each other." Before Emma could respond, Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house appeared around the corner, her face flushed with embarrassment and determination. "Miss Hartwell," she called out, hurrying toward them with obvious reluctance. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news." Emma braced herself for another blow. "Let me guess. You can no longer accommodate me at the boarding house?" Mrs. Patterson's face crumpled with genuine regret. "I'm so sorry, dear." "The other boarders, well, they've made their feelings quite clear. Mrs. Henderson threatened to move her family out if you remained, and I simply can't afford to lose that many paying guests." "I understand," Emma said gently, surprising the older woman with her grace. "You have to think of your livelihood. I don't hold it against you." Mrs. Patterson looked between Emma and Thomas, clearly torn between social pressure and personal affection. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I think you're brave. Foolish perhaps, but brave. And Mr. Brennan is a good man, whatever others might say about his station." After Mrs. Patterson left, Emma found herself truly facing her new reality. Cast out by her family, Dismissed from her position, unwelcome at the boarding house, she was officially destitute and disgraced, with nowhere to turn except to the man whose life she was disrupting simply by loving him. "The room above the shop," she said finally. "Is the offer still open?" Thomas's smile was warm and relieved. "Always." They spent the morning making the storage room habitable. Thomas moved his supplies with quiet efficiency, while Emma scrubbed years of dust from the single window and swept the rough wooden floors. It wasn't much, a small space with bare walls and a leaky roof. But as Emma hung her few dresses on pegs Thomas installed and arranged her books on a makeshift shelf, she felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Boston, the satisfaction of making a home with her own hands. "It's not what you're used to," Thomas said, watching her smooth the quilt Mrs. Patterson had quietly pressed into her hands along with a basket of food. "It's perfect," Emma replied, and meant it. "It's ours." The word hung between them, full of promise and possibility. Thomas stepped closer, his calloused hands gentle as they framed her face. "Emma," he said softly, "I need you to know that whatever happens next, whatever the town does or says, I'm going to marry you. Properly, publicly, with all the respect you deserve. I may not be able to give you the life your father wanted for you, but I can give you my name and my protection and every bit of love I have in me." Emma felt tears spring to her eyes at the fierce tenderness in his voice. "Thomas Brennan, are you proposing to me in a storage room?" "I'm proposing to you everywhere," he replied, his smile breaking through the intensity. "In the storage room, in the shop, in the middle of Main Street if necessary. I'm proposing to you every day until you say yes." "Yes," Emma whispered, rising up on her toes to kiss him. "Yes to everything." Their first week living above the shop established a routine that felt both scandalous and surprisingly domestic. Emma woke each morning to the sound of Thomas lighting the forge below, the rhythmic hammering that had first drawn her to him now serving as her daily symphony. She spent her days reading, writing letters to distant friends who might help her find another teaching position, and gradually learning the rhythms of frontier life. But it was the evenings that became precious to both of them. After Thomas closed the shop, they would sit together in Emma's small room, she helping him with increasingly complex reading exercises while he shared the stories and dreams he'd kept locked inside for years. "Read this one," Emma said one evening, pointing to a passage in a book of poetry she'd brought from Boston. Thomas studied the page carefully, his finger tracing the words as he sounded them out. "Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference." "Robert Frost," Emma said softly. "Do you understand what he's saying?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering. That sometimes the hard choice is the right choice, even if you can't see where it leads. "Exactly." Emma leaned against his shoulder, marveling at how quickly he grasped not just the words but the meaning beneath them. "We took the road less traveled, didn't we?" "Aye," Thomas agreed, his arm tightening around her, "and I wouldn't trade it for all the easy roads in the world." It was the following Friday when their fragile peace was shattered. Emma was in the shop watching Thomas work on an intricate iron gate for the church, when a group of women approached the open doorway. Mrs. Abernathy led them, her face set in lines of righteous disapproval. "Mr. Brennan," she called out, not bothering to enter the shop. "We need to speak with you." Thomas set down his hammer, moving to stand protectively in front of Emma. "Mrs. Abernathy, what can I do for you?" "You can end this disgraceful arrangement immediately," she replied coldly. "The entire town is talking about your living situation. It's a scandal that reflects poorly on all of us." "Miss Hartwell is renting a room above my shop," Thomas said carefully. "I fail to see how that concerns anyone else." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her face flushed with indignation. "Don't try to pretend this is some innocent business arrangement. Everyone knows what's really happening here." Emma moved to stand beside Thomas, lifting her chin with quiet dignity. "And what exactly do you think is happening here, Mrs. Henderson?" "You're living in sin with this man," Mrs. Abernathy said bluntly. "Flaunting your immorality in front of our children, corrupting our community with your shameless behavior." "I'm living independently, supporting myself, and conducting myself with perfect propriety," Emma replied firmly. "If you see something shameful in that..." Perhaps the problem lies with your imagination, not my behavior. Mrs. Abernathy's eyes flashed with anger. Your very presence here is shameful. A woman of your supposed breeding, carrying on with a common tradesman, bringing disgrace to our town. That's enough, Thomas interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. You want to insult me, that's your business. But you will not speak to Miss Hartwell with disrespect. We'll speak to her however we please, Mrs. Henderson snapped. She's made her choice. She can live with the consequences. As the women turned to leave, Mrs. Abernathy paused in the doorway. Mark my words, Mr. Brennan. This won't end well for either of you. The decent people of this town won't tolerate this situation much longer. After they left, Emma and Thomas stood in the sudden quiet of the shop, both shaken by the venom in the women's words. They mean to drive us out, Thomas said finally. Let them try, Emma replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Thomas, I didn't sacrifice everything I had just to run at the first sign of trouble. If they want to fight, they'll have one. Thomas looked at her, really looked, and saw not the refined Eastern lady who had stepped off the stagecoach 3 months ago, but a woman forged in the fire of her own choices, tempered by love and hardened by determination. In that case, he said, pulling her close, we'd better start planning our wedding. If we're going to scandalize this town, we might as well do it properly. Emma laughed despite everything, feeling the truth of it settle in her chest like warmth from his forge. They had chosen the harder road, the one that led through conflict and uncertainty. But it was their road, built with their own hands, leading toward a future they would create together. Some things Emma had learned were worth any amount of fire to forge them into something lasting and true. The morning of their wedding dawned crisp and clear, with autumn painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to echo the fire of Thomas's forge. Emma stood at the small window of her room above the shop, watching the sun rise over Cedar Falls and feeling a mixture of anticipation and defiance that made her blood sing. Today she would become Mrs. Thomas Brennan, wife of a blacksmith, and there wasn't a force on earth that could make her regret that choice. Thomas had been up before dawn, as was his habit, but instead of working at his forge, he'd been preparing for the ceremony. Pastor Williams had agreed to perform the service despite the town's disapproval. The elderly minister had quietly confided that he'd seen enough of life to know the difference between true love and mere social convenience. Are you ready for this? Thomas asked, appearing in the doorway of her room. He wore his best suit, the dark fabric emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders and the steadiness in his blue eyes. In his hands, he carried something wrapped in soft cloth. I've never been more ready for anything in my life, Emma replied, smoothing the skirt of her wedding dress. A simple blue gown she'd sewn herself from fabric Mrs. Patterson had quietly helped her purchase. Thomas stepped closer, unwrapping the cloth to reveal what lay beneath. Emma's breath caught in her throat. It was a necklace unlike anything she'd ever seen. Delicate links of silver-bright steel, each one individually forged and polished, connected to form a chain that seemed to flow like water. At its center hung a pendant shaped like an open book, its pages appearing to flutter in some invisible breeze. I know it's not gold or silver like what you're used to, Thomas said, his voice uncertain. But I wanted to give you something that came from my hands, something that represented what we mean to each other. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she understood the symbolism. Books and fire, she whispered, touching the pendant with reverent fingers. Knowledge and passion, forged together. Will you wear it? Thomas asked. In answer, Emma turned her back to him, lifting her hair so he could fasten the necklace around her throat. His fingers were gentle against her skin, and when she turned to face him again, she saw something in his eyes that took her breath away. Not just love, but wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe she had chosen him. Thomas, she said softly, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. In all my life, no one has ever given me anything as beautiful as this. Not because of what it's worth, but because of what it means. Before he could respond, the sound of raised voices from the street below drew their attention. Emma moved to the window and felt her heart sink at what she saw. A crowd had gathered outside the shop, not friends come to wish them well, but an angry mob led by Mrs. Abernathy and several prominent townsmen. This has gone far enough, Mrs. Abernathy's voice carried clearly in the morning air. "We will not stand by and watch this immoral display corrupt our community." Thomas moved beside Emma, his jaw tightening as he took in the scene. "They mean to stop the wedding." "They can try," Emma said, but she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. There had to be 20 people down there, all of them convinced they were defending morality and decency by preventing two people who loved each other from making a public commitment. "Emma," Thomas said quietly, "if you want to call this off, if the price is too high—" "Don't you dare," Emma interrupted, turning to face him with blazing eyes. "Don't you dare give them that victory. We're getting married today, Thomas Brennan, even if we have to fight our way to the church." Thomas's smile was fierce and proud. "Then let's go show them what we're made of." They descended the stairs to find the crowd had grown even larger. Men and women Emma had taught, people she'd considered friends, now stood with faces twisted by self-righteous anger. But as they emerged from the shop, Emma noticed something that gave her hope. Not everyone in the crowd looked convinced. Some faces showed uncertainty, even sympathy. "Miss Hartwell," Mrs. Abernathy called out, "it's not too late to come to your senses. End this madness before you destroy yourself completely." Emma took Thomas's arm and walked forward with quiet dignity. "Mrs. Abernathy," she said, her voice carrying clearly, "I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I'm afraid your definition of madness and mine are quite different. You're throwing your life away for a moment's infatuation," another voice shouted from the crowd. "This man can't give you anything. No position, no security, no future worth having." "You're wrong," Emma replied, stopping in the middle of the street and turning to address the entire crowd. "This man has given me everything worth having. He's given me respect without condescension, love without conditions, and the courage to be exactly who I am instead of who others expect me to be." A murmur ran through the crowd, but Mrs. Abernathy wasn't finished. "Pretty words won't feed you when reality sets in. What happens when you're living in poverty, when you realize what you've given up? What happens when you need a doctor but can't afford one? When your children have no prospects because of their father's station? What happens," Thomas said, speaking for the first time, his voice calm but carrying the strength of forged steel, "is that we face it together. What happens is that we build something honest and real, instead of something pretty and false." He turned to address the crowd directly, his presence commanding despite, or perhaps because of, his working man's clothes and calloused hands. "You all know me," he said. "I've shod your horses, repaired your gates, fixed what was broken, and made it strong again. I've never cheated anyone, never failed to stand behind my work, never asked for more than fair payment for honest labor. If that makes me unworthy of respect, if that makes me too low for a good woman to love, then you're welcome to that opinion. But you're not welcome to stop us from proving you wrong." An uncomfortable silence fell over the crowd. These people did know Thomas, had relied on his skill, trusted his integrity, benefited from his craftsmanship. Faced with his quiet dignity, some of the anger seemed to drain from their faces. But Mrs. Abernathy wasn't ready to concede defeat. "Fine words from both of you," she said coldly, "but words don't change the facts. This union goes against everything decent and proper. Ma'am, with respect, I think you're wrong about that." The voice came from the edge of the crowd, and Emma turned to see Pastor Williams approaching. The elderly minister walked with the careful dignity of age, his weathered face kind but resolute. "Pastor Williams," Mrs. Abernathy said, clearly flustered, "surely you can't approve of this mockery of marriage?" "I see no mockery here," the pastor replied calmly. "I see two people who love each other, who have faced opposition with grace and dignity, who are committed to building a life together based on mutual respect and shared values. If that's not what marriage should be, then I've been preaching the wrong gospel for 50 years. He stepped forward, taking his place beside Emma and Thomas. "Now I believe we have a wedding to conduct, unless, of course, anyone here has a legal objection to these proceedings." The crowd shifted restlessly, but no one spoke up. Whatever their personal feelings, they had no legal grounds to prevent the marriage. Mrs. Abernathy made one last desperate attempt. "You'll regret this, Emma Hartwell. Mark my words. You'll come crawling back, begging for forgiveness, when you realize what you've thrown away." Emma looked at the woman who had tried so hard to control her life, feeling not anger, but pity. "Mrs. Abernathy," she said gently, "I threw away a cage. What I've found is freedom." The wedding ceremony was simple but profound. Standing in the street where their love story had played out, surrounded by the mixed reactions of their community, Emma and Thomas spoke their vows with quiet conviction. "I, Emma, take you, Thomas, to be my husband," Emma said, her voice clear and strong. "I promise to love you not despite who you are, but because of who you are. I promise to stand beside you, to build our future together with patience and faith, and to never let anyone make me ashamed of choosing you." "I, Thomas, take you, Emma, to be my wife," Thomas replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I promise to love you with all the strength in my body and all the devotion in my heart. I promise to protect you, provide for you, and spend every day of my life proving worthy of the gift you've given me." Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife. And when Thomas kissed his bride, a few people in the crowd actually applauded. Not many, but enough to remind Emma that not everyone in Cedar Falls was ruled by prejudice and social climbing. As the crowd began to disperse, some people approached to offer quiet congratulations. Mrs. Patterson pressed a small cake into Emma's hands with tears in her eyes. Young Sally Morrison broke away from her disapproving mother to hug Emma around the waist. Even a few of the men who worked alongside Thomas offered gruff but genuine good wishes. "So what now?" Thomas asked as they stood together in front of their shop, their home, watching the last of the crowd drift away. Emma looked at her husband, at this strong, talented, generous man who had seen her worth when others saw only scandal. She thought of the life stretching ahead of them, uncertain, challenging, but built on love and mutual respect instead of social expectations. "Now we prove them wrong," she said, slipping her hand into his. "We build something beautiful together. We show this town what love looks like when it's forged in fire and tested by adversity." Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, trying out her new name. "I like the sound of that plan." As they walked into their shop together, husband and wife, Emma felt the steel necklace warm against her throat, a reminder that the strongest things in life weren't always the most precious by society's standards, but they were the most lasting. Behind them, the forge sat ready to be lit, ready for another day of creating something beautiful and useful from raw materials and skilled hands. Just like their marriage, just like their love. And so across these frontier lands, another tale drifts away with the morning mist. A story of how a refined school teacher discovered that the most valuable lessons aren't always found in books, and how a humble blacksmith learned that love, like the finest steel, grows stronger when tested by fire. Emma Hartwell came to Cedar Falls believing she understood the difference between education and ignorance, between refinement and roughness, between a life worth living and one merely endured. But when she whispered those fateful words, "I can read your heart like a book," she discovered that true literacy isn't about recognizing letters on a page. It's about reading the character written in a person's actions, the poetry hidden in their dreams, and the stories told by hands that create beauty from raw iron and flame. Thomas Brennan thought he was asking for reading lessons when he knocked on that schoolhouse door. What he found instead was a woman who saw past his calloused hands to the artist's soul beneath, who understood that a man's worth isn't measured by his social position, but by the quality of his heart and the integrity of his work. Emma didn't just teach him to read words, she taught him to read the possibilities in his own life. But here's what makes their love story truly extraordinary. It wasn't about a refined lady saving a rough working man, or a strong man protecting a helpless woman. It was about two people who recognized in each other the missing pieces of their own souls. Emma found the passion and authenticity she'd been seeking behind Boston's marble facades. Thomas found the appreciation and understanding he'd never dared hope for in a world that dismissed him as just a blacksmith. Their wedding in the streets of Cedar Falls proved something that echoes through every generation, that love doesn't ask permission from society, doesn't bow to expectations, and doesn't apologize for seeing worth where others see only obstacles. When Emma chose Thomas over family fortune and social position, she chose truth over convenience, authenticity over artifice, love over fear. And Thomas? He forged their wedding jewelry from steel instead of gold, creating something that would last longer than precious metals, something that represented not wealth, but the strength of two people committed to building a life together with their own hands. So here's what I want to know from you, the folks who've journeyed with us through this tale of books and fire. Have you ever met someone who saw your true worth when the world saw only your circumstances? Have you ever had to choose between what was expected of you and what your heart knew was right? Have you ever discovered that the most beautiful things in life aren't the ones society values most, but the ones crafted with love and tested by adversity? Tell us in the comments, what's your definition of true refinement? Is it measured by social position and material wealth, or by character and authenticity? Have you ever had to fight for a love that others didn't understand or approve of? If this story of courage, craftsmanship, and choosing love over convention touched something in your heart, if it reminded you that the strongest bonds are forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by mutual respect, then smash that like button, ring that notification bell, and subscribe for more tales where love conquers all. Not through magic or wealth, but through the daily choice to see worth where others see only surface differences. Because out here in the wild west of the human heart, there are still so many stories of ordinary people creating extraordinary love through patience, understanding, and the courage to forge their own path, regardless of what society expects. Until next time, keep your hearts open to unexpected teachers, your courage ready for when love demands everything of you. And remember, sometimes the most precious things in life are the ones crafted by loving hands from the simplest materials. This is Wild West Stories, where every forge fire burns bright with possibility, every lesson learned with love changes everything, and every heart worth having is worth any amount of fire to forge into something lasting and true. Ride safe, partners. We'll see you on the next trail.